But look, I hope you guys having a good day today. We are still here, thankfully. The world hasn't ended. We are in the wake of Joe Biden making a reckless, deranged, sociopathic decision to allow missiles to be fired into Russia. And almost immediately after it was allowed, what do you know? Missiles were fired into Bryansk region. If I remember correctly, I think it was six. Five of them were shot down. One was hit, but it ultimately landed. And when it landed, it caught a fire. The fire was put out, and apparently no damage was done. That is besides the point. The truth be told, Attack Adams hasn't necessarily had that great of a showing. In fact, none of the wonder weapons that have been released into the battlefield has had that much of an effect. It seems that it had some effect in the very beginning, but after a while, Russia effectively finds countermeasures, in which case the effectiveness of the weapon goes down. Add to that, they only have 50 Attack Adams missiles in the first place. And so you are allowing a policy that you know is not going to change the context on the battlefield. And despite it not changing the context on the battlefield, what you risk is oblivion. Let's be very clear. What you risk is oblivion. And the fact of the matter is, it doesn't really matter that the missile didn't do anything. It was the fact that it was done at all, meaning the very intent of allowing it after Putin said it was a red line is the issue. And look, Joe Biden might have two thoughts in mind on this. One is to start a war, meaning I am doing this explicitly to go over the red line, knowing full well it is going to start a war because I want to precipitate some kind of crisis. Okay, that is insane. That is deranged. But we're talking about a man who didn't necessarily have the competence to even stand trial, according to her report, let alone the cognitive gravitas to even run in an election. And yet, he has the ability to potentially end the world and initiate an act of war against the Russian Federation. Be very clear. That's what Joe Biden has just done. And what they plan to do, or under this model of thought, either to start a war or to salami slice, to effectively do what they do with China, with the one China policy. We believe in the one China policy. Here's a weapon. Here's a gun. We believe in the one China policy, but we will stand by Taiwan and we will militarily defend Taiwan. Okay, dude, which one is it? It's this policy of incremental adjustment with the thought that because it's incremental, the person may not necessarily respond fully and forcefully because of the increment. There could be this thought that Putin, knowing that Donald Trump is coming into play, may not want to do anything that is too escalatory, knowing Trump may actually try to end the war. Now, under this thought process, that breaks into a few other thoughts. A, under that model, either Joe Biden is thinking Trump is going to end it, so I need to escalate or accelerate this notion of dragging Ukraine into NATO, whether in fact or de facto, and to do so through small incremental movements, one after the next, with the thought that Putin is not necessarily going to respond forcefully if the steps are done incrementally. Now, you can imagine or you can understand the problem with this, right? If I am taking 0.25, eventually I will get to the number one. And it's kind of the same thing with this, regardless of whether it's incremental or not. You are making movements that is getting NATO further ingratiated into the conflict in a way where you are in direct conflict with Russia, which is what that missile attack into Russia is. That was NATO attacking the Russian Federation. Have no doubt about it. That is the way Russia sees it, and they see it correctly. Fact of the matter is, as Putin had explained once before, it is impossible to fire those missiles without the U.S. giving guidance and intelligence to fire those missiles. This is not a situation where Ukraine is doing this. This is a situation where Ukraine may want to, but ultimately it is the U.S. that is pulling the trigger. If the thought is Joe Biden doing a salami slice, then this is only the first step. That means that if Russia does not respond, then they would consider Putin to be bluffing, meaning taking pragmatism as weakness and taking another extra step to get closer and closer, further ingratiating NATO into Ukraine in somewhat of a de facto sense. Now, as I point out, if that's true, then the attack items is just the first step. And how far they go is unclear. I mean, for the longest time, there was this question of whether they were going to invade Western Ukraine in order to prevent Russia from taking it all, when it became clear that Ukraine was collapsing on the battlefield. It has become clear that Ukraine is collapsing on the battlefield. And this canard of North Korean troops that does not make sense, has not been validated, but has yet been accepted by Western media, has been used as the device by which to justify escalating the war. Understand, though, if Russia doesn't respond forcefully, they will take it as weakness, and they will go further, and they will go further, and they will go further. Russia is forced in this situation to respond forcefully enough in order to get across, we are not fucking around. Because up to this point, any action that has been done to prevent a war has only escalated the war because of the West and the way we view any notion of passivity or any notion of pragmatism as fundamental weakness. It's a strange situation, right? Meaning me trying to be pragmatic and stopping the war and not taking an aggressive or reckless action is being seen as weakness. And so you're putting me in a position where I am forced to respond in such a forceful way to get across we are not playing around. The wild part about this idea, that the belief that Putin is bluffing, is that Russia has been killing Ukrainians to the hundreds of thousands. How are they bluffing when they are already involved in a war? And yet, here we are, with the Biden administration taking such a reckless action. And this is after losing an election where the American public decided that they preferred Donald Trump and his stated policy for Ukraine as opposed to the Biden administration's reckless, sociopathic, cynical attempt to keep Ukraine into the Western geopolitical sphere of influence. You know, the other thought, though, is that this is for posterity. Whereas the first one brings us to the brink of war within 2 months, because Joe Biden would have to accelerate all of the stuff into 2 months if indeed that's what his plan is. This is Scott Rivers' idea, by the way, that Joe Biden's plan is to try to drag Ukraine into NATO as far as possible. And if Russia doesn't necessarily respond forcefully, that they would take one step after the next, and that Russia has to respond forcefully in order to prevent a nuclear war. We're in dangerous territory. The other point of view is that what Joe Biden is doing is he knows that this is not going to change the context of the battlefield any more than any other weapon has changed the context of the battlefield. And he knows that the chances that attack atoms are going to do anything are low. And that he knows that Trump, or at the very least believes, that Trump is going to end the war, and that Russia believes that there's a chance for Trump to end the war, in which case Russia may not necessarily take a provocative action with the salami slice, this incremental step. And because they won't do that, then he could say, well, look, I did everything I could. I gave them everything that they wanted. I gave them every weapon system. I gave them tanks. I gave them jets. I even allowed long-range strikes. So in 100 years, when they look back, they can say, well, Joe Biden did everything he could to keep Ukraine into the Western sphere of influence. He failed at the task, but he did everything in his power to do so. Now, this takes a more innocent look at it, or this is a more innocent point of view. Because under this point of view, this is not necessarily escalation for the point of escalation. This is escalation for the point of ego, hubris, and for some kind of historical context. I honestly don't know which one it is, to be honest. Truth be told, either way you look at it, it seems that the goal is to thumb his nose at Trump and screw over Trump's potential attempts and trying to bring it to a close. Now, you had Thomas Massey come out and effectively said Joe Biden was committed war crimes. Well, not war crimes. He said he wasn't using treason. He was pointing out that Joe Biden is effectively ignoring the results of the presidential election, where the overwhelming majority of the American public voted Trump. And in voting Trump, the issue of war was litigated in that election. And being litigated, the way it broke down is that the overwhelming majority of the public agreed with Donald Trump's idea of ending a war, a senseless, useless war, a catastrophe that has killed hundreds of thousands of people for no reason. And I'm saying no reason, and maybe the better way to put it is no good reason. Trying to keep a country into your sphere of influence is not an adequate reason to initiate and provoke a war. It's just not. And I know from the US standpoint, we look at it as, well, those are just Ukrainians dying. They're not Americans dying. And so for us putting money into it, it's worth it. If we have to put $200 billion into sticking it to the Russians and using Ukraine as a battering ram, we will do so. If you go back and look at the memo, net means net, William Burns predicted all of this. And one of the questions that I had after reading that net means net memo was, did they sleepwalk into this in spite of what Burns said in that memo? Or did they look at that memo and say, this is exactly what we want to happen? We want to create a Hobbes choice. Either Russia takes muscular action in order to prevent the expansion of NATO into Ukraine, or Russia allows itself to be militarily surrounded. Either one of those choices are perfectly fine, because both of those choices allow, in the first case, a fait accompli, because we've been able to surround Russia. And if anything pops off militarily, either because we spoofed it or in earnest, we would have military armaments surrounding the country. In the other case, is the way it played out. We will scream that Russia, unprovoked, for no reason at all, attacked Ukraine and wants to attack all of Europe. We can pass sanctions, and we can use Ukraine as a battering ram to attack the military in regards to Russia. That's the way it turned out. And my question was always, okay, well, did they do that on purpose? And if they did it on purpose, did they believe that A, they were going to win the military fight, or B, that they were going to be able to economically destroy the country, or C, that they were going to be able to accomplish both? Because obviously, the way it ended up is that they were trying to accomplish both and succeeded at neither. Again, I point out there were the Minsk agreements 1 and 2. This was something that was agreed upon by the European leaders and the US, and they blew it off immediately. And a deal that was supposed to end the war ended up being the thing that allowed Ukraine to build up a military and provoke a war. You must understand, this is not a situation where Russia just went into Ukraine for no reason. As William Burns pointed out in the memo, net means net. A civil war occurred on their border. They were involved because it was a civil war on their border, and ethnic Russian Ukrainians were being killed to the tune of 14,000. And being killed to the tune of 14,000, Putin gets involved in the civil war and goes on the side of the ethnic Russian Ukrainians in that civil war. We ignore that. We act like they're not even Ukrainians. And that's the way we acted for the entire way through, basically being dishonest. And our appraisal of A, us knocking over that government, there's that. B, blowing off the Minsk agreements, there's that. And then in the Istanbul agreement, so there was an opportunity to end the conflict almost immediately after it started. You get the West telling Zelensky, nope, we're going to give you all the weapons, we're going to give you all the money, and we're going to want you to go out and fight. Pointless. Ukraine is lost. And not just lost, they're experiencing manpower shortages to such an extent that they are losing more and more territory. And in losing more and more territory, Russia has started to open up a new front because they don't have manpower issues, which makes the whole canard of North Korea so utterly and completely ridiculous. Look, the reason I'm going into history a little bit on this is because I'm trying to get across how senseless and how much of a catastrophe this is, and how this wasn't done for any great reason. The reason was purely geopolitical expansion of bringing Ukraine into the Western sphere of influence. It was just that. No more, no less. That is our interest in Ukraine. That is not something that benefits any random American. That is not something that benefits any person that you're going to run into on any particular daily basis. This is something that purely elites in Washington, specifically in the Democratic Party and many in the Republican Party, from their view of America and expanding American influence, It's what they wanted. They failed. Now, the question becomes, are they going to accept that failure? Or are they going to continue to push? They do not have the military capability, conventional military capability, to change the context of that battlefield. Europe itself, with all of its militaries, do not have the capability to change the context of that battlefield. The US has no capability to change the context of that battlefield short of using nuclear weapons. That's where we are. We have no capability to do anything about what's happening on the ground. And the catch becomes, what are we going to do? Are they going to accept the loss? Are they going to keep pushing? Are they going to continue to escalate? Because I would tell you this, we're on the Russian border, not the other way around. And Putin in this situation has no room, has no capability to lose credibility in regards to bluffing. Meaning, my point is, he's not bluffing. I've listened to no one that has talked about this that is outside of the West that believes that Putin is bluffing. They have been killing hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians already. Why do you think they are bluffing? And do you really trust your leaders, the people who got you into this, who destroyed your own economies from governments that have fundamentally collapsed? If you look at Macron for the moment, look at the governments that are involved that are doing this. They are massively and deeply unpopular and not representative of the populations to which they govern. Macron is only in power. Macron has been losing one election after the next. And the only reason his man is in office at this point, meaning in charge in the UK as prime minister in France, is purely because Macron had this kind of mini coup in order to get his guy in. Somebody who the voters did not choose, meaning from a party the voters did not choose. German government has collapsed. Scholz will be out on his ass in the next year's election. And apparently they couldn't have the elections because they didn't have enough paper to do the elections. That's how bad off things are in Germany. As far as the UK, Keir Starmer is sitting there with an approval rating that is negative 38. Negative 38. And Joe Biden, of course, is not even a lame duck. He didn't even have sense enough to be able to run again in another election. And despite not having the cognitive wherewithal to run in another election and receive the no confidence vote, by the way, from a standpoint of policy, he is still going through with something that could fundamentally end the world and have no capability at all to change anything. I'm saying it's deranged. I'm saying it's deeply cynical. And now you have Jake Sullivan, who came out effectively saying, look, attack items is not going to change anything. Ukraine needs to bring in more people. It needs to bring in its kids. You know, you have people who are in their 20s, bring those people into the war. Now, this is after all of those videos have come out with Ukrainians grabbing people off the streets, throwing them in a van, giving them a potato, giving them a rifle, and sending them out there to fight. It is deeply, deeply cynical. It is deeply, deeply cynical. I want to show and one more thing. The U.S. has not confirmed that they've changed policy on Ukraine. You heard that right. The U.S. has not confirmed, and I'm saying not, N-O-T, that they've changed policy on Ukraine. And I found that to be super fascinating. I thought I had the clip up. But when they asked, I think it was either Matthew Miller or one of the other State Department spokesmen, hey, you guys are allowing missiles to be fired into Russia? And his response was super non-committal without giving a definitive yes or no on that issue. And whether he gives a yes or no on the issue is irrelevant. It's clearly happening. Zelensky came out, of course, and said the missiles will speak for itself. So, okay, yeah, he's right. The missiles will speak for itself. They wouldn't be doing it if the policy wasn't allowed, which means by definition that the policy is allowed. My point is, we're waiting for a Russian response. And I would imagine that response will be significant and will be significant enough to get across. Don't F with us. I could be wrong. I think I agree with Scott Ritter on this. If Russia doesn't respond, then it means then they're going to take it as a bluff. Meaning, regardless of what it means, it will be seen that Putin is bluffing. And this will create problems down the line when NATO tries to accelerate or escalate even more and even more and even more. At some point, you're going to have to do something. We'll see. This is a very dangerous time. I will tell you that. And what's wild about it is right after, I remember we were doing that show and I was like, yeah, this is a dangerous time because Joe Biden is in for the last few months. And who knows what Joe Biden is going to do while he's in office, especially knowing that his $200 billion grift may be coming to an end. And before that show was over with, people were announcing they've already attacked or Joe Biden has given permission to launch long-range missiles into the country. Just outrageous, completely outrageous.